Good morning, and thank you for joining us for today's episode in our Facebook Live series. I'm your host, Edna Friedberg. October is Disability Awareness Month, a moment to reflect on one of the lesser known but no less important targets of Nazi violence, people with disabilities. Please join me in welcoming today's guest, Dr. Patricia Heberer-Rice. Hi there, Patricia.
Hi, Edna. It's great to see you again.
It is. I miss seeing you.
Me too.
Patricia is my friend, my colleague, the museum's senior historian, and has spent many years researching this dark chapter of history. During today's show, we ask that you please submit questions for Patricia by posting them in the comment section, and we'll get to as many of them live in the course of the show as we can. Also, we all experience the occasional technology glitch. Don't worry, don't stress about it. Come back. It will be available to view on demand on Facebook, so you can watch it at your convenience and share it with your friends. Now, to start, Patricia, I'm going to guess that most of our viewers likely know about the 6 million Jewish people killed during the Holocaust. But can you please tell us about the Nazis' first victims of mass murder, German children with disabilities, including many so-called Aryan children?
Yes, and this is part of the Nazis' first program of mass murder, as you said, the so-called euthanasia program, which targeted institutionalized patients with disabilities. It predated the more systematic mass murder of Jews that we know as the Holocaust by about 2 years, and the first victims of euthanasia were children. In August of 1939, about 2 weeks before World War II broke out in Europe, the Reich Interior Ministry ordered doctors and midwives to report infants and toddlers under the age of 3 who had severe mental or physical disabilities. And a few months later, that October, parents of children with disabilities were encouraged to bring their children to special pediatric clinics throughout Germany. In reality, these were children's killing wards, where children were murdered with overdoses of medication and sometimes to starvation. About 10,000 physically and mentally disabled children, German children, were murdered as a result of this child euthanasia program during the war years. Now, we usually associate mass murder programs in Nazi Germany with the SS, but in this killing program, this was carried out by doctors and nurses.
And people may wonder why. I mean, it's hard to make sense of any of the killings from this era, but let's talk about the ideology behind this disturbing program. How did the Nazis frame people with physical and mental disabilities as somehow a threat or a danger to society?
Right. So a lot of Nazi policies that involved the German medical community came from eugenics. That was a popular scientific movement of the late 19th, early 20th centuries. And today, eugenics has been soundly discredited, but we have to remember that in its day, it was seen as cutting-edge science by scientists in many countries, including here in the United States. And eugenicists believe that society's ills, criminality, mental illness, alcoholism, even poverty, were hereditary. That is, nature, not nurture, made you the kind of person you were. And it's really the idea of selective breeding. If you can breed a better dog or a better horse, as human beings have done for millennia, centuries, you can breed a better person and a better national body. And if you see someone undergoing a eugenic examination, the Nazis took eugenic ideas to a really deadly extreme with the idea of restoring the racial integrity of Germany. And they believed that people with disabilities were not only threats to the Nazi state, but that they were life unworthy of life.
And that they were a drain on society, right? A financial drain, a burden, a biological blemish, if you will.
Exactly, Edna. Exactly.
For viewers who are interested, we invite you to learn more about eugenics and how its pseudoscientific theories shape Nazi policies by looking in the comments section. We'll be posting links to our online Holocaust encyclopedia where you can delve deeper into the subject. We'd like to say good morning and welcome to viewers who are watching from around the country. Hello to you in Gastonia, North Carolina, in Philadelphia, Tallahassee, Florida, Miami, and oh goody, in my hometown of Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. Not far, you are a Southern Illinois girl, Patricia.
Yes, that's right. Both Illinoisans.
Also, we'd like to send greetings to our viewers who are watching around the world. Hello to you in India, the Philippines, Southern Italy, and Athens, Greece. To turn back to our subject at hand, though, Patricia, we're going to actually show, talking about this way that people with disabilities were portrayed and dehumanized in Nazi society. Let's show some disturbing and dehumanizing propaganda that the Nazis created in order to rationalize a sterilization program that targeted people with disabilities. This is very upsetting footage to watch. I'll just caution our viewers, but let's have a look.
Irrtum ist, dass sich solche Kranken glücklich fühlen und am Leben hängen. Sie haben überhaupt kein Daseinsbewusstsein. Sie hängen nur infolge ihrer totalen Kritiklosigkeit an den Gewohnheiten ihres Zustands. Jede medizinische Behandlung oder auch nur Beeinflussung ist hier ausgeschlossen. Was soll aus diesen unschuldigen Opfern werden?
Now, it's important to note that when the narrator uses the term victims, he means that the individuals we see are victims of their condition. Patricia, could you please just explain some of what we saw, what it was intended to accomplish or communicate?
Yes, these kind of films were usually shown as trailers for feature films. And this is propaganda, which was created for the sterilization program, which began in 1934 under the Nazi regime and sterilized about 400,000 Germans. And the Nazi propagandists cherry-picked very specific images to exhibit the worst cases of physical and mental disabilities in an effort to dehumanize these individuals. This very radical sterilization program paved the way for the murder of people with disabilities.
Now, we've begun by talking about the murder of children with disabilities, but children did not remain the only targets of this program. Please explain about that.
You're completely right, and Nazi planners very quickly moved to extend the program to adults already living in institutional settings. And there is a villa in the central Berlin, which was really the nerve center for this secret program, and its street address, Tiergartenstrasse 4, gave the operation its code name, Operation T4. And by the end of the war, 250,000 people with disabilities living in institutions were murdered by the Nazi regime.
So this was deliberate, it was centralized, it was planned.
Correct.
We have a question from a viewer named Manny. He's asking, would people with disabilities like autism, obsessive compulsive disorder, and attention deficit hyperactive disorder have been killed as well?
Right. Some things like anxiety disorders or learning disabilities, these individuals usually aren't in institutions and probably weren't in those days either. Autism is, so they would probably not have been killed. Autism is a little different. At the time, nobody understood autism in children, and it was misdiagnosed as child schizophrenia. I should say schizophrenia for children is very rare. So what we're seeing in those instances was actually autism. And yes, many children were murdered who had autism to some degree.
So what I'm hearing from you also, it's difficult for us not to project back some of our understandings of disabilities, of mental illness to that time, but that some of the lack of nuance and understanding led people to be classified as in this damaged category. Is that right?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And we'll see an example of that in a few minutes, actually. So
yeah, let's actually turn to an example. Let's try to understand the actual human impact of the T4, the so-called euthanasia program. Please tell us about one of the ordinary people, a young woman named Magdalena Meyer-Leibnitz, who became a victim of this program.
Yeah, so Magdalena, and there you see a picture of her, Magdalena Meyer-Leibnitz. She was born in 1916 into a very prominent family near Stuttgart in southwestern Germany. Her father was a professor. Her uncle became a prominent post-war politician after 1945 in the Federal Republic of Germany. Her experience really shows that the program didn't spare individuals who came from positions of wealth and power. She attended Gymnasium, which in Germany is a kind of prep school in the early 1930s. And most students who go to this kind of school are bound for college. And that certainly wasn't typical for most Germans at the time, and certainly not typical for a young woman like Magdalena. family and friends begin to notice that she behaves differently. In about 1935, she had to leave school. In retrospect, she was probably exhibiting the first symptoms of schizophrenia, with which she was later diagnosed. And about 3 years later, in 1938, her family places her in a private clinic near her hometown named Kennenberg. And in 1941, along with some other patients from that clinic, she was secretly moved to the Hadamar mental health facility near Frankfurt. And there she was gassed at the age of 25. And Magdalena was one of 10,000 patients who were murdered in a very short time frame, 8 months, at Hadamar, which is a euthanasia killing center.
And I'm struck hearing Magdalena's biography, looking at the photos. She almost seems like a poster girl for the League of German Girls. She has blonde braids. Her family has influential connections, certainly has money. And as you said, put her into a private clinic. So they were trying to give her the best possible care. But let's be clear, at Hadamar, the facility to which she was transferred, who were the personnel carrying out gassings in this supposedly medical clinical setting?
Right, and these are doctors and nurses who had been, at this stage in the program, recruited especially for the killing program. And these personnel who were supposed to care and protect care for and protect these patients were murdering them.
And we have a question related to that because these are people with families, people who love them, people who have put them into clinical settings because they think it's a supportive environment. A viewer named Christian is asking, how did the general public not notice as people with disabilities started to disappear? And if I can expand on that, if you can tell us also, did Magdalena's family know what was happening to her and what were they told of her death? Maybe that will help illustrate.
Sure. So there's an enormous effort to keep this program a secret. It's actually a homicide on German soil. And so there's a massive bureaucracy to try to hide the evidence. And Magdalena's family is told that she's sent to another facility as a war measure. There was bombing, for instance. So this made her difficult to trace. They don't know that she actually went to Hadamar. And after Magdalena was gassed and cremated, her family was given false information about her death. The program's operatives provide fictitious dates, places, and causes of death on the death certificate for people who were murdered in this program. And Magdalena's parents, like other victims' families, would have received what was called a consolation letter, informing them falsely that she had died of tuberculosis. So that was made up. And Magdalena's family would also have received an urn with what they were told were her ashes, her remains, but which in reality were taken from a pile of ashes on the crematorium floor, which is extremely cynical and callous when you think about it.
And again, look into the comments section. We'll be posting additional links to our online Holocaust encyclopedia about the cover-up, about the bureaucratic slip-ups that alerted people that what they were hearing was probably not the whole story. If I remember correctly, Patricia, that there were sometimes families who erroneously received not one, but 2 urns of supposed remains of their loved one, or more than one consolation letter listing different causes. You know, this was a big operation, and sometimes there were mistakes.
Yes, absolutely.
And that actually led to some protests and objections, right?
Yeah, the families of victims are really among the first people to figure out what's going on. And pretty soon this becomes an open secret. And at least one famous bishop speaks out against euthanasia from the pulpit in August of 1941. And right about that time, not only because of that, but for other reasons as well, the program actually goes to a pause for the adult killings in the T4 program until they can kind of figure out how to make the program more covert. So the protests actually, and the knowledge of the German people about this clandestine program actually work to shut the program down, at least for a number of months.
I think that's a very significant and enlightening example, because it's tempting, or maybe in some ways almost comforting, to think that either one, the entire German population was completely brainwashed or hypnotized into buying all parts of the Nazi program, or 2, that there was absolutely nothing you could do. that
Yes,
there was only
absolutely.
terror, that the regime was not responsive to public opinion. And this case actually shows that neither of those is true.
Right. Right. Very counterintuitive.
We have another question, I believe, from a student, Patricia, named Stardeja. She's asking, were the methods of murdering these people used to test out ways to murder the Jews later?
That's a really interesting question. And yes, that's absolutely true. This, as I said, first mass killing program of the Nazis, the gassing technology developed for this program is later embroidered upon to murder Jews. And the T4 program for adults used, at this particular point, bottled chemically produced carbon monoxide gas to kill its victims. And the planners of the final solution expand on this technology using carbon monoxide gas generated from motor engine exhaust to create first the mobile gas van used to kill Jews and other victims in the killing fields of the German-occupied Soviet Union, and then in stationary gas chambers at Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. Those are 3 killing centers that murdered 1.7 million Jews in German-occupied Poland. And the staff of these 3 camps, who had learned to murder innocent and vulnerable victims in the so-called euthanasia program, are deployed there as the main German personnel at these 3 killing centers. So there's this link between the mass murder programs. It's very significant.
And it's a link that's both in technology, but also in personnel, that it's a sort of testing ground for methods of killing and a proving ground for people who are willing and able and compliant to carry out this kind of mass murder. I'd like to encourage viewers, if you missed our last Facebook Live, actually, about photos that were collected by an SS officer who was high up at one of the killing centers in occupied Poland. Part of his career trajectory involved being a burner, someone who disposed of bodies at one of these so-called euthanasia facilities. And there we trace how he and some of his colleagues, comrades, later rose through the ranks to the larger killing operations of Jews. We'd like to welcome this morning some of our favorite viewers, teacher Mark Nelson and his 8th grade artists at Central School in Kewanee, Illinois. Nice to have you back, Mr. Nelson and crew. Patricia, as I mentioned in your introduction, you have spent many, many years trying to add texture, important historical detail, and personality to this chapter of history. And you have previously called those targeted by this program the nameless victims of the Nazis. Why don't we know more about them as individuals even today, so many years after the fact?
Right. Because of the documentation and testimonies we have of survivors and witnesses, we know a lot about the identity of Jewish victims during the Holocaust. And this is not true for euthanasia victims. German privacy laws are very strict. That's pretty common for the entire continent. Most European countries have very strict privacy laws, and medical records in Germany are generally closed even after the person dies, which isn't always the case here in the States. So only the medical director of facilities that still retain these records has the right to decide whether the names or content of individual patient files can be opened to scholars. And in the case of one particular facility at Kaufbeuren in southwestern Germany, the medical director at the time, Michael von Kranach, became convinced that these victims should be memorialized by giving them their names. And in the
Patricia, I'm going to interrupt you a second. When you say at the time, you mean recently, not at the time of Nazism.
Right. He was, yes, quite right. He was the medical director until, I believe, just recently, from 1980 until the early 2000s, at least. He's in private practice today. And in the year 2000, he gave us access to more than 1,000 medical records of patients who were murdered at this facility. So now we can learn who these people are.
And let's learn about what have we learned because of these records.
Right. So Kaufbeuren, and there you see the photograph there of the main building at Kaufbeuren. It's still a facility for a mental health facility today. That's very common, actually, because they're built to be mental health facilities. It operated since the 1890s or so as a long-term care facility. In 1941, it became involved in the murder of children under the child euthanasia program. And between summer of 1941 and 1942, I already spoke about there being a pause in the adult killing program because it had become an open secret. But euthanasia facilities begin to kill again adults in 1942. And in 1943, Kaufbeuren becomes one of these killing facilities. So it's killing adults and children. 209 children and about 1,350 adults in all were murdered at this facility. So 1,500 patients.
I'd like to acknowledge that we're seeing comments from a number of people, a number of viewers who are relating to this history on a very personal and intimate level. Here's one from a viewer named Kathy who writes, "I would have been killed. I am hearing impaired and have bipolar disorder. Let that sink in." Yes, Kathy, we see you, we understand what you're saying, and others like you who are posting here. That's part of why we feel it is so important to show this, the ways that Nazi ideology and Nazi society and doctors and nurses who had taken an oath to care, dehumanized people, not for anything they did, not for anything they believe, but simply for who they are and who their biology had created them to be, and that they felt was not a life worth living. It is profoundly disturbing and painful to look at and offends our sensibilities as it should. Along those lines, let's continue to put faces and names so we're not just talking about statistics, Patricia, and you have painstakingly worked to do this. Please tell us about one of the patients at Kaufbeuren, a young boy.
Yes, I'm thinking of the young boy Ernst Losse. Ernst Losse was born into a Jenisch family. You see him there as a very young boy. The Jenisch are an ethnic group of what were itinerant peddlers who lived and still live in Central Europe, and the Nazis associated them with the so-called gypsies, and whom they persecuted. And Ernst's mother's died when he was just 4 years old. And after his father and his elder brothers are arrested and sent to the concentration camps as gypsies, so-called gypsies, Ernst and his two sisters were sent to a children's home near Augsburg, where he was born. And Ernst is often caught stealing in the home, at this particular home, and he's sent to a reform school in 1940. And here he continued to get into trouble with the school authorities. Today, we might call Ernst a bit of a juvenile delinquent, but a psychiatrist at the time diagnosed him as a psychopath. That was the diagnosis. Now, today, we think of the term psychopath and we think someone like Ted Bundy, the serial killer. But in those days, it meant somebody who committed immoral or illegal acts because they suffered from moral degeneracy and mental illness. There you see a little bit older picture of Ernst a little bit later. He's sent, because of this diagnosis, to the pediatric unit at the Kaufbeuren Mental Health Facility in April 1942. And there he continues to pilfer. But the staff actually considered him to be a kind of funny little prankster. He was very helpful for them. And they seemed to have a soft spot for him. But unfortunately, in August of 1944, the director of the facility, a man named Valentin Fadlhauser, suspected that Losse had figured out that patients were being murdered at the facility. At this point, it's quite clear to most thinking people in Germany that they're going to lose the war, and perhaps they didn't want this child as a potential witness. So at the age of 14, in August 1944, he was killed with a lethal overdose of narcotics. His death certificate says that he dies of bronchial pneumonia, but of course we know that those records are falsified. And the people who murdered Ernst Losse were tried by newly reconstructed German courts after the war and received very light sentences. The nurse who was believed to have murdered him, for example, got 4 years. And after she was released for time served, at about 2 years, went back to nursing and got a state pension in the 1960s. So,
It's hard not to feel a sense of outrage and injustice, not only for the lack of penalty for the medical personnel who killed him, but at Ernst, who just was so unlucky in so many ways to lose his mother as a young child, to lose the rest of his family to the Nazi camp system, to be termed a deviant or outside of society just for being a boy. It is really just terrible, and to look into his eyes. So we have a question, Patricia, from a viewer named Charlene. She's asking, how did the Nazis convince doctors and nurses to cooperate? We saw some of the type of propaganda earlier, but I know in your research you've been able to determine whether or not at some places like Kaufbeuren the staff was enthusiastic. Could you shed a little light on that, please?
Yeah, so during the gassing program, they actually recruited individuals to work for the euthanasia program. They brought them to Berlin, to that nerve center that I spoke about, swore them to secrecy, asked them if they would like to participate, and more often than agreed to participate. And nothing happened, incidentally, to those who did not. Later at Kaufbeuren, it becomes a little more complicated because the director and the euthanasia center kind of decide overnight, this facility is going to be a euthanasia center, and the staff is then told they're not recruited, and suddenly they're in a euthanasia center. Some of the staff felt that this was a mercy to murder, unfortunately, these vulnerable individuals. Some of the staff clearly bought into the eugenic ideas we thought about, and others felt a certain duress to stay, that they might be punished if they left. So for a variety of reasons, doctors and nurses participated in this program.
And how enthusiastic was the staff at Kaufbeuren? You found in your research some very troubling evidence.
Yeah, so it's really very interesting. Kaufbeuren is notorious for this very reason that I'm about to tell you. In late April 1945, American forces occupied the region around Augsburg, and the local townspeople tell them that there's a facility and they're killing the patients. And they liberate, in essence, the facility and take away some of the top officials at Kaufbeuren. Of course, the patients have to remain because they're in a hospital. And so some of the staff remains too. And when the Army Medical Corps unit returns to the facility a month later to bring provisions for the patients, they make a really gruesome discovery. They discover that Kaufbeuren nurses are still killing their patients. The last dying by lethal injection just hours before this inspection. So it seems they really bought into this concept that life is not, life not worth living, that it became a part of their routine, because nearly 3 weeks after the collapse of Nazi Germany, they're still murdering patients at Kaufbeuren.
And who was the last victim of the killing operation there?
Yes, a little boy. His name was Richard Jena, and you see him there. He was quite a little boy, a vulnerable little boy. He was murdered by a lethal overdose of medication when he was 4 years old on the 29th of May, 1945. Remember, Germany surrendered on the 8th of May, 1945. He was classified as a feeble-minded idiot. That's medical terminology of the day, not ours. He had an intellectual disability. And he was among the 209 miners who were killed at Kaufbeuren between December 1941 and May 1945.
And now, 75 years after his death, it is a solemn duty to be able to pay tribute, put a face and a name to Richard Jena. Patricia, we have a question from a viewer named Chuck. He's asking, what element of the Nazis' actions toward children with disability was rooted in the history of anti-Semitism in Germany?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and not a lot. These are really separate programs. The euthanasia program really comes from a place of eugenics. It comes from a place of wanting to cleanse your race. So, and equally, of course, the Nazis' final solution is a similar kind of program, because you're cleansing the Jews from Germany and German-occupied lands. But in this particular program, it was about cleansing one's own race. And so very, very few relatively few of the victims of child euthanasia or adult euthanasia are actually Jews. About 5,000 Jews are murdered in the euthanasia program before the deportation of Jews begins in October of 1941 from Germany. This was a place that this program is really confined to Germany and the territory it directly annexes. And the overwhelming number, the rest of the 250,000 are German Aryans.
And as you said, German Aryans, so people who otherwise, if not for their disabilities, would have been classified as not only not inferior, but part of this superior race.
Correct.
We have a comment. A woman named Jenny writes in to say, my uncle was one of those victims. He was a resident of an institution he was then secretly transferred, and he was murdered in 1940 in the Brandenburg so-called euthanasia center. I found out about the existence of this uncle only 3.5 years ago.
Yes, Brandenburg was the first of the killing centers to open and claimed many of these 5,000 Jewish victims that we talked about and thousands of others.
Thank you, Jenny, and we're sorry about your uncle. Thank you for sharing that with us today. Before we close, because we are nearly out of time, Patricia, as you mentioned earlier, part of the reason that you're able to share so much about the brutal history of this psychiatric institution, of Kaufbeuren in particular, is because of Dr. Michael von Kranack, the physician who decades later was profoundly troubled by the violent complicity of his predecessors. What else can you tell us about that and about how you work with this history today with people in the field?
Right. Michael von Kranack was a former medical director. You see him there. I let him know that he would be featured today, so perhaps he's watching us live. If so, hello, Dr. von Kranack. In 2000, he granted us access to the wartime patient records from this facility, and they really offer a window into the lives of the 250,000 children and adults killed in the euthanasia program. And Dr. von Kranack was horrified, the role of doctors playing, some of them very prominent, playing roles in this euthanasia program. And when asked what motivated him to make these records public and give these people their names, he said the suffered injustice, the degradation and debasement were so profound that each patient must have wished that this wrong was finally acknowledged and that he or she was personally recognized as a person worthy of life. And that's a direct quote from Dr. von Kranack. And here you're looking at the place where today there stands a memorial to the thousands of murdered victims of people with disabilities killed by the Nazi regime. This is Tiergartenstrasse 4. Today it is right in front of the Berlin Philharmonic. It was hit by bombs in the end of the war. And you see commemoration of this headquarters, which now honors the victims.
And how do you adapt this history and share it with people today who are training to be doctors, nurses, medical professionals, Patricia?
Right. So I give a lot of lectures to medical audiences around the country and here in the Washington area as well, working with medical faculty and students to kind of show a worst case scenario of this particular history. And physicians, obviously, they're not Nazi doctors or bad doctors, but they do run into things like peer pressure, the fact that sometimes they have to perform triage in this COVID environment. They may have to decide, or physicians like them decide, who gets to be on a ventilator, who does not. So they also face particular difficulties just in doing their jobs. And today, of course, they're our frontline heroes. And I think this particular part of the history is interesting to them, compelling to them, and hopefully it will help them to remember that medical ethics are a living code.
A living code indeed. Thank you so much, Patricia, for teaching us today about this dark chapter of history and for the work you're doing to help medical students learn about how their counterparts were corrupted or complicit during the Nazi era and the critical role of ethics. Thank you.
Thank you, Edna.
A viewer named Joy has written in to say, we cannot change the past. We have to look to the future to make sure that children with disabilities have a voice. that they are treated with respect and the same as children without disability. This terrible time in our history should never happen again. And I think those are very appropriate words, Joy, with which to close. We are very grateful to Dr. Michal von Kronach and those who have begun to share the identities of those murdered by the Nazis because of their disabilities so that they are no longer nameless. Through these ongoing efforts, we can tell their stories and we can honor their lives. For those of you who are watching here in the Washington, D.C. area, our museum, I am pleased to report, just 2 days ago has reopened for limited visitation. To learn about our opening protocols, our health and safety protocols, look in our comment section to find a link, and you can also there reserve timed passes. Passes are required. We also hope that you will join us for our next program in 2 weeks on Tuesday, November 10th, or just under 2 weeks, Tuesday, November 10th at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time in the United States. Very important historical anniversary. Our next Facebook Live program will be about the Night of Broken Glass through a survivor's eyes. Our guest, Susan Warsinger, was a 9-year-old girl on Kristallnacht, a night of widespread targeted violence against Jews throughout Greater Germany in 1938. And our program will be held on the anniversary of those terrible events. Until then, thank you again for joining us. Be safe, be well, wherever you are. Bye-bye.